I'll introduce some of the questions that have come before, and actually quite a lot of the questions that have come during the course of the presentation. If you want to ask some that come to mind in the interim, please do. But the first question is, Peter, and if people haven't said they want it to be anonymous, I will give their names, otherwise I'll just say it. What is your experience and what are the unique challenges of applying this balanced scorecard approach to investment consultants, given that that example we showed, Peter, was more towards the fiduciary managers?
We have certainly had more focus on the fiduciary manager side, but we have also had probably a 2/3, 1/3 sort of split, I would say, on the investment consultant side as well. What we have seen is on the investment consulting side that the detail that they're going into is much more in depth, which is interesting. I don't really know why that should be in particular. But nonetheless, that is the case. So we're seeing both sides, and it is being as effectively applied on both sides. I think it's fair to say so far. I should also add probably that bear in mind that a lot of clients, a lot of trustee boards have, or some trustee boards have oversight in place anyway of their fiduciary managers, and what we're being asked to do is actually to combine those two things together. So the measurement of the strategic investment objectives becomes part of the overall annual oversight that we're conducting for the trustees of their fiduciary manager in any event.
Okay, we've got one from the attendees, Derek Scott. Are performance bonuses for fiduciary managers or consultants becoming more common? What about misalignment of interests, agency issues, Peter?
I think that we're seeing less performance-based fees than more. We have a view as a business that the issue of alignment of interests by having performance fees in place just doesn't hold water in our view. It certainly adds a lot of complexity and raises the question of a fiduciary manager if they have some on performance-related bonuses and some not. Does it mean that there is some that are more aligned than others? And that just isn't the case. The portfolio managers, generally speaking, don't know whether there is a performance fee in place or not, so they do the same job. So that therefore raises the question as to whether there's any value in them at all, apart from for the fiduciary manager, if it's a one-way street. It adds complexity. And in the cases where we've been carrying out oversight and have done analysis of performance fees, it is very clear that there is only probably one example that I can remember where the structure has rewarded skill rather than luck.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Peter. I've got another one from Alan Martin. Do you think, and I might start to answer this, Peter, and then hand it over to you. So I'll answer the easy bit, give you longer to think about it. Do you think liability plus benchmark is appropriate for all funds at all times? So I think what I'd like to say is we're very focused on that liability plus benchmark, because if you as a trustee board have set a strategic objective to be fully funded, let's say on a technical provisions basis by 2026, you know the contributions that are going to come in from the sponsor. They're agreed with the actuary if there are deficit recovery contributions as well. And it's really the maths we're interested in. That liability plus target is the amount you need to achieve to be certain mathematically that you're going to be fully funded on a technical provisions basis by 2026. So that's why we focus on it. A lot of the reports we get from and we oversee for investment consultants and from fiduciary managers get this mixed up with funding level. Funding level is important, but as Peter says, it can be influenced by lots of different things, such as longevity, such as extra contributions from the sponsor. So we're particularly interested when we're assessing the investment advisor at how well they're doing at delivering the risk-adjusted investment return. Anything to add to that, Peter?
I think we should recognise, and it's a fair point that Alan raises, that there are some schemes that are setting up different sets of strategic investment objectives for different types of advisors. So some maybe have an alternatives advisor or a growth fiduciary manager for partial fiduciary management within the portfolio. And clearly then you've got a more specific investment objective to achieve against a benchmark, an investment benchmark, not a liability benchmark. So I think it's ensuring that the objective is appropriate for the particular situation.
We've got another question from the audience, Y Wong. Is the CMA requirement to set objectives and let trustees decide how to use that? Or is there a requirement to implement an assessment framework? If so, by when? And are these to be published anywhere? i.e., is this compulsory or is it voluntary? Peter.
So it is compulsory for them to set objectives and to measure those objectives in some sort of an assessment framework. The objectives had to be set, as we said right at the start, by the 10th of December. And I don't think there was a specific date requirement by which they had to have a detailed or demonstrate a detailed assessment framework. That was a given, but the regulator did lay out in November and then again just before the end of the year, I think, Donny, a more detailed framework as to what that would look like. Using the balanced scorecard type-of approach as an example, but with much more detail in terms of the level and number of objectives related to it.
Yeah, the only thing I might add to that, Peter, is the TPR the pension regulator, sorry, did come out with guidance just before the 10th of December. It had more factors and many more objectives than us, and they weren't all rammable, i.e. relevant, achievable, measurable. Sorry, they're all relevant, but we didn't think they were necessarily measurable. So what we've sought to do with that is come up with a set of criteria with the trustee boards we're working with, where you can measure success and it can help you judge value for money. I was speaking to the pension regulator last week, and as you'll all be aware, the DWP are currently writing the regulations, which should come out on the 1st of October. And the DWP are expecting to bring out additional guidance on this later in the year. We thought the TPR guidance was maybe a little bit vaguer than we would like, so we sought to sort of tighten it up using best practice from around the world, really.
Donny, I'll just go back to Alan's question. I think it was Alan, and thanks Ian for giving an additional response to that as well, which is, and I'll read it, that liability plus is not quite so good for CDI portfolios, with liability measurement linked to asset yield less a haircut. In that case, it's the initial yield and change in haircut that's important. Yeah. So which is a good point, Ian, thank you.
Yeah, I think actually on that, it's probably worth saying to the audience with regard to fiduciary management, given we developed the fiduciary management performance standard, we've seen all the areas that fiduciary managers operate in, and then we passed that before passing it to the CFA. And it was fair to say, Peter, that fiduciary management was being used particularly where you were looking for liabilities plus 1.5% or greater. And probably the greatest preponderance was 1.5 to 2.5% above liabilities. We're seeing a bit of a sea change at the moment, aren't we, Peter, in terms of fiduciary managers offering solutions below 1.5% above liabilities and even 0.5 to 1.
Yeah, that's certainly what we're seeing. And I think as schemes, although obviously Q1 will have impacted how many schemes are in this position, but we're seeing schemes who are in a much better position in terms of funding levels and full funding on a TP basis and closer to self-sufficiency, of course, looking then at buyout, and fiduciary managers considering just how to actually align with that, given the obvious conflict that exists as the scheme moves to buyout. But that's encouraging and something that we recognise that fiduciary managers have to respond to. Ian's mentioned CDI in his comment there, and CDI again is much more to the fore, and recognition that cash flows have to be managed much more effectively and actively as well. So yes, right across the whole spectrum.
Yeah, we've got a good question from Ian McDougall. What weight would you put on getting input from the sponsoring employer on the balanced scorecard, Peter?
Thanks, Ian, for that. Had the same discussion yesterday, actually, with a group of trustees, board of trustees. I think what you need to remember, I guess, is that these are the trustees' objectives. They're not the sponsoring employer's objectives. So I would suggest, it's difficult to put a weight on the level of input. I think it's important, as we said, to engage all stakeholders, sponsoring employer being one of the key stakeholders, clearly. But I think it's getting important that the sponsor recognises that they're giving input. They're not trying to make a decision on what the objectives should look like.
Peter, we've got a good question. It's a little bit long, so thank you, Wai Wong, but I think it is worth reading out because it gets to the nub of what the CMA was trying to clean up. We currently get an annual fee proposal from our investment consultant for core services, as well as fixed and discretionary projects. And we do an annual appraisal. The strategic objectives and balanced scorecards will certainly improve the evaluation process. But how do you envisage transitioning for a fee for delivering services to one of a fees for performance? And how do you see generally the background for fees changing with investment consultants and with fiduciary managers?
Thanks, Donny, for asking me to answer that one. A good question, Wei. And I think, I don't know the answer to this. We're seeing various different options that are being introduced into fee proposals. Clearly more fixed fees, incorporating all elements of service from investment consultants, which is beginning to remove slightly the opaque nature of fees within an investment consulting framework. We are seeing discretionary elements being introduced where advisors are saying to the trustees, you've got 10 or 15% to play with. Either you pay as it or you don't if you're not happy with the service we're providing. And we're also seeing, and in fairness, this is more on the fiduciary management side, structures being developed by fiduciary managers that incorporate a level of service alpha, as they describe it, as well as investment alpha, and various different components to that from a qualitative perspective, agreed in discussion with the trustees as to the outcome. What or whether we agree that or how we see an evolution to a performance-related fee using a balanced scorecard approach for an investment advisory relationship, we'd have to think through the detail of how the two things can sit side by side. Donny, you may have a firm view on that, but I don't at this stage.
Yeah, the only bit I was going to add, and it partly comes from my 4 years as an independent trustee, as well as sitting within IC Select for the last 2 years. It used to frustrate me sometimes with advisory that you got a retained fee, and basically as a rule of thumb, you doubled it to get to the fee you'd eventually pay. So you weren't quite sure what you're going to be paying for each year. certainly there's been a bit more of an evolution within advisory to having an all-in-one fee by some of the advisors. And certainly within fiduciary management, I'm quite impressed by the way, as you know, we put together a fairly long list of services that are required to help trustees and the pension fund get to a better place. And basically that fee, Peter, covers everything. There's no extra fees for extra time or extra projects. Have you any thoughts or comments on that disparity that exists a wee bit still between fiduciary management being quite clean and it being a bit more opaque with advisory at times, not always?
Yeah, but we still see that the majority of the time, or comments from trustees who are worried in every trustee board about asking a question of an advisor if there isn't a fixed fee in place,
Yeah.
simply because they don't know how much they're going to charge to answer the question.
Yeah.
That isn't meant to be facetious. That's what we see and hear. I mean, there are more fixed fees being seen when we're doing advisory searches.
Yep.
For schemes or for trustees, but they still aren't prevalent. And where they are, sometimes the trustees react because they seem to be high in relation to the other proposals on the table. But the trustees do then ultimately recognise that it's the advisor that's taking the risk. Because it's an open-ended book in terms of how much work is done.
Yeah, I've got a short question here, which I'll answer from Ian McRae again. Thanks, Ian. How are fiduciary managers responding to being scored? Are you able to describe any changes in behaviour? It's interesting that because obviously we helped a number set their strategic objectives, both investment consultants and fiduciary managers leading up to the 10th of December. And we've been sharing the last few months this detailed framework, and we're just giving you the top of the iceberg. It gets a lot more detailed than you see there in certain cases. And actually, what's encouraging for me, Peter, is the way that those are being accepted by fiduciary managers. I mean, there was a 700 million fiduciary manager that are converted last year from advisory, and I thought we might get a bit of pushback in terms of some of the measures, performance and risk and ESG and service level from them, but there seems to be a general acceptance that this makes sense. What are you seeing from your clients?
I think so. One of the clients, their advisor, I was quite taken aback, but pleased that his comment was, and a person well recognised in the industry, was that he's been trying for 30 years to get to a way for investment advisors to be able to demonstrate value, which we have as well, or Roger Brown has since this business was formed. And this person was clear that he felt that this was the best example he'd seen of being able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Peter, we got another question from Derek Scott, and thanks, Derek. We'll certainly get back to you on the ones that we're not able to answer, but investment consultants generally seem happier to place ESG topics on trustee agendas rather than cross-transparency and or potential cost savings. How do you at IC Select, that's you, Peter, intend to challenge this bias?
I think if we're sitting with a trustee board and guiding a trustee board, it's making sure that their advisor is coming to the table with the issues that need to be addressed. ESG is taking up a lot of time for trustees, and rightly so, but it needs to be balanced by their other priorities and concerns. And if the trustee board, if Derek is feeling that their advisor is bringing to the table topics that aren't appropriate over other topics, then the trustees should be shouting about it. And if we're advising the trustees and sitting alongside them, then we would shout about it. And
I've got an easy one from Alan Martin, Peter, which is, can there be any meaningful FMRI investment consulting performance appraisal in the current climate of markets when markets are being artificially inflated by governments and central banks colluding with massive money printing, QE? And can there be meaningful asset allocation, timing, stock selection decisions in this type of environment? And do we see, perhaps underlying that, Peter, do we see differences in behavior between what the fiduciary managers are doing and what we see the investment consultants are doing?
I think, sorry, can you remind me the first part of the question?
It was basically how relevant is this in COVID-19, particularly given the nature of the expansion in the government balance sheet.
Yes, sorry. So,
yeah.
So the response that Alan, I'm sure, would give, but also advisors and managers and asset managers as well as fiduciary managers would give, is that this is a short-term issue against long-term liabilities. And what consideration needs to be given is how this short-term impacts the longer-term strategy to achieve the longer-term funding of the longer-term liabilities. That doesn't answer the question, but I think it's important not to react to the short-term, but keep a focus on what ultimately you're trying to achieve.
I might answer that in a slightly different way. One of the pension funds we moved from advisory to fiduciary management last year said to us recently, "We're so pleased we made this move. We can sleep easy at night knowing someone else is worrying about this." So, I mean, underlying that, it means that if you are in an advisor relationship, there's a lot of pressure, isn't there, Peter, on the trustees to know what to do in this very complex, very fast changing, very fast moving market. And I wouldn't, that's not an easy thing for anyone to deal with at the moment.
No, I can only imagine the time and effort and number of this sort of call that's been taking place for trustees that are within an advisory relationship as compared with the engagements that trustees within a fiduciary management structure have had to have. Not that they're any less concerned that benefits are going to be paid to members and to meet those obligations, but as you say, they are at least reliant on organisations that are expert in the market, are looking at this 24 hours a day and making decisions on their behalf to accommodate it. And much more effectively.
We're getting close to the end. We've got 5 minutes and we will call a close just before then. I've got an anonymous question. There's nothing wrong with it. I think it's a perfectly good question, but the biggest risk you can face as a trustee, Peter, is setting the correct benchmark for the consultant who should take responsibility for that process.
It's the trustee's responsibility to ensure that they are determining the right benchmark for the consultant or for the advice provision from the consultant. We have tussled with this for many years, again, because of the opaque nature of that type of investment governance framework and the challenge of what the consultant is actually responsible for. Because of the time it may take to implement a decision if the advice is agreed. We also have a view that the advice being provided by the consultant needs to be presented and communicated effectively. The consultant presumably believes the advice that is being provided and that that advice is correct at the time that it's given. If the trustees then don't accept the advice, then you could argue that the consultant isn't doing a good job at actually presenting and communicating it, if the consultant believes it's right. So I think the responsibility has to sit with the trustees to determine what that is. They may have to go away and ask somebody to help them do that, and that wouldn't be their consultant. But where it is fraught with challenge, and we know that, one of the things that we have tried to do at the last attempt about 18 months ago, I think, done, which was to corral the investment consultants together to agree an initiative to have the consultants provide into a database all of their information about their clients, what they're achieving for those clients in terms of improvements in funding level, what they're charging their clients in terms of the total fees, and what their portfolios look like and what the risk of those portfolios look like, the investment risk and the returns, of course. That would be a way of developing the sort of benchmark that this questioner is alluding to. But the reaction from the investment consultants, and that was the great and good of the investment consultants, was that they weren't going to play. It didn't add anything to their business, although in our view it gave the trustees a huge amount in terms of information and the tools that they need over and above strategic investment objectives to challenge the advisors.
Yeah, and Peter, you know, we felt a bit disappointed after 2 years' work when that fell flat on its face, but actually I feel it doesn't really matter now, because trustee boards are setting clear investment objectives and are going to set clearer investment objectives. We are going to get the measuring success and judging value for money. So I think the lid's been lifted, and I think both the fiduciary management, investment consulting and delegated communities will do their best to live up to those expectations. I'm going to draw it to a close now, and I'm just going to finish with one comment, which I'll keep anonymous. It was a Freudian slip I used, apparently. I mentioned the high jump bar, whereas this particular attendee felt that many consultants and fiduciary managers should be for the high jump. So from high jump bar to for the high jump, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join Peter and I, and we will address any unanswered questions separately. Thank you. Thank you for me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.